What's the one thing you can ask God for and He'll give it to you? Wisdom. Wisdom. If we ask God for wisdom, He'll give it to us. In fact, He'll give it to us liberally. That means there's plenty to go around. Now, sometimes I know that we all say unwise things. We all do things that are not very wise. Solomon was given wisdom because that's what he asked for. He was also given riches, the wealth and the influence that went with that, and the conditional promise that if you follow me all the days of your life, you will have a long life. Of course, Solomon kind of reneged on that one. And there are some things that we looked at. We're going to kind of wrap this up. We looked at the Ark of the Covenant. We looked at those three things that created a trend in Solomon's life. The daughter of Pharaoh, that marriage to her. Now, it was not, and I didn't want to get bogged down with detail, but it was not necessarily unlawful for a Jewish king to marry a Gentile. What was unlawful was for you to marry one that would not convert. And that was not his first wife. And we all know that Solomon had more than one with women. And 700 wives, 300 concubines, that's enough for any man to get wore out with. I don't know what he was thinking. We also recognize something else, that he had a tendency to go big in everything. And so while those sacrifices in and of themselves were not necessarily wrong, we believe that he had his heart maybe in the right place. He had the best of intentions, but sometimes even the best of intentions fall drastically short when we find ourselves disobeying God. And then we also found that he had a tendency to worship in the high places. Now, God gave Solomon wisdom. This is very simply the tale of two heads. That's the title of the message. The tale of two heads. Jewish rabbi legend has that Solomon was confronted with a situation that the Sanhedrin could not figure out. A man was born with two heads, considered to be demonic. This man had 7 sons, and the man died. One of those sons was born with 2 heads. Now, I can't believe that this stuff makes its way into Jewish legend, but it did. So the man had 2 heads. He had a son with 2 heads. At the Sanhedrin, they debated on how many shares this man should get. Should he get equal shares, or because there are 2 heads, should he get double share? He thought he should get double his share. The Sanhedrin could not figure it out. So they sent it to Solomon. We need for you to be the judge between these 7 brothers. So Solomon took his time. He listened to each one of them. And then he did something kind of odd. He called for a pot so that he could boil water in. And while they talked, the water began to boil. And so he dipped a cup into the boiling water, and he went over to the man with 2 heads, and he poured it on his feet. And when the man with 2 heads had hot boiling water poured on his feet, both heads cried out. So it was decided by Solomon, you get 1 share because you're one man with 2 heads. Now that's legend. But what I do think, and I do recognize, is that Solomon was given wisdom, and he was given wisdom that would precede his reputation. The whole world learned of Solomon. Now, in 1 Kings chapter 3, we have the first incident where his intellect and his savvy and his quote-unquote heart of understanding come into play. Not 2 heads, but 2 babies. 2 babies. Proverbs chapter 8 says that Solomon would not only have wisdom, but that wisdom would be esteemed highly. Proverbs chapter 8, verse number 2. This is speaking of wisdom. Doth not wisdom cry, and understanding put forth her voice? She standeth in the top of high places. Now remember, high places. Now we're familiar with that term, right? in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 2, and 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 1. And we found that there was that which was referred to as high places. As I read that, the first thing that came to my mind is, did I make a theological blunder, a theological boo-boo? And so it bothered me just a little bit, I got to tell you. Over in chapter 9, and you can read this for yourself. In chapter 9, in verse 3, it's talking of wisdom again. She hath set forth her maidens, she crieth upon the highest places of the city. Verse 14, same chapter. For she sitteth at the door of her house on a seat in high places of the city. So Lord and I had a little visit. Now, it's after the fact. I've already preached last week's message. So we had a little visit. Lord, was my understanding incorrect? Now, I am not a Hebrew scholar. I am not an Aramaic scholar. I am not a scholar in Greek. But I can read a Greek lexicon. I can read a Hebrew word. And I was sweating bullets for a while. In 1 Kings chapter 3, the idea of the tabernacle being a high place, the word that's used there is a word that denotes geography, altitude. It was set in high places, geographically above the city. And there was this tendency for people to worship in high places, places that were set on hills, places where they would worship originally the Lord. They would build an altar and they would burn sacrifice. But I told you last week, as I followed it up this week, that all of the kings would have to deal with this. By the time Hezekiah was king, there were people that were offering sacrifices to Baal and Ashtaroth, and it was out of hand. So he destroyed all the high places geographically. The word in Proverbs chapter 8 and chapter 9 is not the same word. In English, it reads high place, but it actually means an altitude of high esteem, dignity. Wisdom stands in the street, and it is considered high in dignity. It is esteemed highly. It rises above everything else. So, I thought I'd share that with you. And as you read your Bible, when you come to those places, you scratch your head and you pray and then start studying, and you'll figure it out. And because that's what I had to do. And I thought that when I had these verses ready for last week, and then as I read them over, I thought, well, they probably need an explanation. Back in 1 Kings chapter 3, there was a situation that we don't know if it happened immediately after he came down and he visited the Ark of the Covenant there in that tent in Jerusalem, but not shortly thereafter, they brought to him two women. Let's read. Not the tale of two heads, but the tale of two babies. Then came there two women that were harlots unto the king. That's code for prostitutes. They were innkeepers in a household where they must have run that household. And so these two harlots came unto the king. That means that more than likely the lower courts could not make a decision. It baffled them. There were no witnesses. I'll explain that in just a second. So they came unto the king, and they stood before him. And the one woman said, O my Lord, I and this woman, we dwell in one house, and I was delivered of a child in this house. And it came to pass that the third day after I was delivered, that this woman was delivered also. In other words, they had a baby within 3 days of each other. So she delivered also, and we were together. There were no strangers in the house with us. We were the only two in the house. Why is that important? Well, you'll see in a second. So this woman's child died in the night because she overlaid it. That means that she very carelessly rolled over on her baby and smothered it. Now that's tragic. That's very tragic. Matthew Henry tried to explain this, and he explained it in his time frame, which is in the 1600s. And it was said of harlots, prostitutes in the 1600s that the one thing that was different is that they took care of their babies. Today, we kill them. Now, there's a thought there, isn't there? So this woman's child died in the night because she rolled over on it, overlaid it. And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me, while thy handmaid slept, and laid it in her bosom, and laid the dead child in my bosom. And when I rose in the morning to give a child suck, behold, it was dead. But when I considered it, in other words, and what mother wouldn't know her own child? And I'm appealing to mothers right now. I don't think there is a mother that's ever been born that wouldn't know her own baby. So when she rose, when she realized and considered it in the morning, behold, this isn't my son. This isn't my boy, which I did bear. And the other woman said, Nay, but the living is my son, and the dead is thy son. And this they said, No, but the dead is thy son, and the living is my son. In other words, they spake this before the king. He went back and forth. And I could just see this. They're standing before the king, and they're disputing the accuracy of the tale that has been told. Now, for the life of me, I can't figure this next part out. By the way, I'm not a woman. You knew that, right? And women go through the valley of the shadow of death to deliver children. And I cannot imagine any woman saying what this one's about to say. But, nonetheless, the tale of two babies. Here we go. Then said the king, well, and what's amazing here is he feeds back what they each said. Then said the king, the one saith, This is my son that liveth, and thy son is dead. And the other says, Nay, but thy son is dead, and my son's living. And the king said, Bring me a sword. And they brought the king a sword. Now, I couldn't find my samurai sword, but if I could have, I was going to put a watermelon up here, and I was going to go through the watermelon and cut it in half. There was a custom in the days of Solomon that if you had a dispute over property and you had no evidence, no witness as to whose property it was, you divided it equally, whether it was land or an actual piece of property. So that practice is not uncommon. To take a sword in hand and to cut a baby in half, well, that's just ludicrous. I mean, that I just can't. A lot of people that I read after, they said, would he have done it? I don't believe so. I think that he probably read the body language, because one of the things that we read about Solomon, especially when we read in chapter 4, is God gave him a heart of understanding, the ability to discern. I heard Denzel Washington speak on the incident with Will Smith to a bishop at the Potter's house, T.D. Jakes. Now, I don't want to say a whole lot about that. But the one thing that I noticed and I picked up on is that as they prayed with Will Smith that night, this is after the fact, he prayed that in the highest moment of your life, that's when the devil comes for you. And that seems to have been the case. Now, what is offensive is what is going to follow. And so I'll get into that in just a minute. So the king said, Bring me a sword. They brought him a sword. And the king said, Divide the living child. And all you mothers are going, I can't fathom this. Divide the living child and give half to one and half to the other. Then spake the woman whose the living child was unto the king, for her bowels yearned upon her son. She loved her son that much that she was willing to give this child to the other woman. So she said, O my Lord, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. Now, I can't, for the life of me, there are things that I just don't understand, and this is one of them. How could any mother say what this next lady said? But she did. The other said, Let it be neither mine nor thine, but divide it. Go ahead and kill it. The king answered and said, Give this child to the other woman. Give this child to the one who was willing to give up the child to spare its life. Now, a lot of people believe that he already knew. I don't know. But either way, he proved a great point. The king answered, said, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. She is the mother. Verse 28, and all of Israel heard of the judgment which the king had judged, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do judgment. Now, I have somewhere in my notes this thought. People have a tendency to see what they want to see. But when wisdom cries forth, what does she say? She cries forth in high places. She's regarded as high in esteem and dignity. Now, what I'm saying is very simple. People, I think, whether it's a king or a president, they can tell when there's wisdom and when there is the lack thereof. And King Solomon's wisdom, it spread abroad. In chapter 4, verse 29, God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding exceeding much in the largeness of heart, even as the sand that is on the seashore. That was the key to Solomon's understanding. It's a little bit beside me, but those trends that we saw last week would carry over into his kingly reign, and at one point, his strange wives would take his heart away from God. Fortunately, toward the end of his life, he repented and followed after God wholly. Now, there's a lot to be said, but Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children in the east and all the children of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men. I did a little research on Ethan and Heman and Calcol and Darda. I remember when the kids were small, Sean and Tim had a He-Man. It's a little figure, and they would go around the house with this little figure, He-Man. Well, He-Man was a singer. He was found in several different references. 1 Chronicles 15:19 is considered that Ethan and Asaph were singers of renown. He-Man is mentioned also in Psalm 89, verse 4, also in Psalm 25, verse 5. He-Man was both a prophet and a singer unto the Lord. What's amazing about this is these were men that were renowned. When you would speak of David and Asaph, I was starting to think about Asaph's fables, but when you spoke of Asaph, you also recognize that Ethan and Heman were men that were renowned, singers, musicians, those that participated in temple worship. So his wisdom, as compared to the conventional wisdom that was there, exceeded all of that. And so that's who those guys were, because I wanted to find out who they were also. And so that's who they were. He was wiser than them, and his fame was in all the nations round about. And he spake 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. And he spake of trees from cedar that is in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springeth out of the wall, and he spake of beasts and of fowl and of creeping things. In other words, I wrote it down. Solomon was a man of some intellect. He searched out these things. He was both a biologist, a zoologist, a botanist. He recognized all things natural. And his wisdom in all of those things, it spread around the world. Around the world. Why is that so important? Because kings would travel to sit at his feet and hear from Solomon. There came in verse 34, of all the people to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all the kings of the earth, which had heard of his wisdom. What is wisdom? It's not just the accumulation of facts and knowledge. It is those facts. It's those facts and that knowledge as it applies itself to biblical understanding. So, whether it be legend or it be the fact of your Bible, Solomon was considered to be the wisest man in all the earth. And I believe where that started was there when he asked God for wisdom. Now, I don't know what you're faced with. And that's why I didn't want to leave too much on the table, and I wanted to finish this. I don't know what you're faced with, and everybody's facing something. But whatever it is, you ask God for wisdom in a sincere heart of faith, and God will give you wisdom. God will give you that wisdom. There's a little phrase that says, and upbraideth not. It means don't be critical on how God reveals himself to you. And also, God is confident that he has your best interest at his heart. So if you're in a dilemma, and it's probably nothing as magnanimous as these two children, one of them dead, one of them living, but there are some things that they take us by surprise. They slip up on us. They catch us, blindside us. And those are the things that we ask God for wisdom. So, it reminds me of a story of 4 boys. And 4 boys were in a car, and they were driving around, and they noticed that they were going to be late for school. So they thought, we'll go in at lunch. Nobody will miss us. So they drove around, and at lunchtime they showed up. Well, they had one of the same teachers for 2 subjects. So after lunch, she was there. And so she asked the boys, what happened? And they said, well, we had a flat tire. We had a flat tire. She said, okay, well, you missed the test this morning. So I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to make that up. Lord, you might want to remember this. I'm going to give you an opportunity to make this test up. Is that okay? Oh, yeah, sure. So she sets them in a room in separate places. There was one question on the test, just one. Which tire was flat? Smart teacher. Which tire was flat? People may be wise in their own eyes. Psalm 14:1, Psalm 53:1. The fool says in his heart there is no God. But seeking the truth and wisdom and knowledge is that which we ask God for. And so I couldn't just leave that there. We'll pick up after Easter on some of the other subjects related to the ark and the temple. And I think that'll be great.